The Switch OLED has been out for a little bit over a year now, and the time that I've been using it, one of the main questions I come back to in my head is, was it worth upgrading to one when I already had a perfectly fine Switch? The Switch OLED is a really interesting mid-cycle upgrade release because, for instance, something like the Switch Lite is a very traditional approach where it is a cheaper system, it's something that is a little easier to produce, maybe it's something you're more comfortable grabbing for a kid. It's just a lower barrier level system, whereas the Switch OLED upon its release became the most expensive model Switch, and while it has a couple different upgrades, really the primary focus is the namesake, it has an OLED display. Compared to the very long and very diverse list of wish list features that people have had for the Switch, OLED, while being a really cool one, may have seemed like not enough to a lot of people. And my thoughts about it when it initially came out was, yes, if you did not own any other form of Switch before, this really was the definitive one to grab because yeah, it's a little extra money, but it is ultimately offering you the best experience and best build quality out of the groups. But the really big hanging question that came after that was, okay, sure, but if I already own a Switch, is it worth upgrading? And at the time, I was a little more non-committal about it. I was like, you can if you want to spend the money. And the more time I've spent over it this past year, look, again, ultimately, you're talking about minimal gains for buying a whole new system. But if I'm going to talk about the best way of playing Switch games, it's the OLED. Something that I think is really important to clarify about my experiences with the OLED over the past year is the fact that I am a primarily handheld player. If you only really ever play dock, if the Switch is purely a docked system to you and you never take it on the go, then yeah, the OLED literally offers nothing for you other than a built-in Ethernet port, which you can also just buy an Ethernet adapter for the regular Switch and it'll still cost less than paying more for the OLED. Built-in Ethernet port aside, all the other updates the OLED has are basically targeted purely at the handheld and on-the-go experience. And some of these upgrades, while they were noticeable at the release of the Switch, now that I've spent more time with them and I go back to older Switches here and there to really kind of compare and think about it, some of these differences actually seem even bigger now. Now, in case you missed out on my comparisons to the regular Switch back when the OLED first came out, there's really three main areas worth talking about that the OLED is an improvement over the regular, which is build quality, audio, and of course, the display. Out of these three, I would say that for me personally, the one that has really stood out the least is the audio quality. And this is something that I talked about back when I initially compared them, where when you play them side by side, there is a noticeable difference. If you play a song on a regular Switch and play that same song on a Switch OLED, you are going to notice the audio quality is better. There's a little more clarity, a bit better separation, a little less tinniness. It is a better audio situation. But it's not really by the leaps and bounds where, let's say, you were using one and then swapped over to another one later, you wouldn't immediately notice the difference and go, oh wow, this sounds so much better. Now, I will also throw out, and this is actually something I referenced in a recent video talking about the Genki waveform earbuds, I don't really consider myself an audiophile. I can definitely tell you when something sounds terrible versus something sounding great, but if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of what stands out and the kind of things that I pay attention to, it's not as big of a focus for me. So there may be some people out there where, yes, the difference in audio is something that is a night and day difference. As for build quality, this is one of those features that I have come to appreciate a little more as time has gone by. The original launch Switch, not the red box, but the one that came out back at launch, that definitely had some build problems, primarily due to the fact that it was just a system that ran hotter than a lot of the later ones, and that would cause some long-term damage over prolonged use. I had the grills break off on it, there's various little cracks in the plastic, and that was something that thankfully did not happen with the red box Switch, but even then, when I hold a regular Switch now versus an OLED, I notice the difference in build right away. The plastics that they use and the screen that are on the regular Switch just feel cheaper compared to the OLED, in a way that, while obviously I'm not looking to drop, throw, or break my Switch anytime soon, the OLED just does feel like a sturdier, more strong build, and that's something that I appreciate in a device that I'm going to be, traveling around and using a lot. And really, the biggest of these is the kickstand. If you watched me over the years, I complained a lot about the original kickstand on the Switch. I never liked its design. It never really worked for me half the time. It would just snap off every time I would try to set up the Switch in tabletop mode, which, in all honesty, yeah, is not my primary way of playing. But in the occasions that I wanted to, it was just a massive headache to use, to the point where I relied on additional accessories to, prop a Switch up instead of relying on the built-in kickstand that's supposed to do that in the first place. And the OLED's kickstand is so much better. Just the longer design of it, the sturdier design of it, it's something that's not snapping off. And honestly, I just like the look and feel of it better because instead of being this protrusion that just takes up one part of the back of the Switch, it's that whole back bottom part, and I think it just ends up looking and working out a lot better. The biggest difference by far, though, is obviously the OLED display. And this is the one thing where when I go back to other model Switches, it actually stands out even more to me. It's kind of like that classic issue of like, if you never play games in 60 and you only ever play them in 30, the first time you see 60, you're like, oh wow, that is better. And then when you get used to 60 and go back to 30, you go, oh wow, yeah, 30 is so much choppier. How did I not notice this before? That's kind of like what it's like going from a Switch OLED back to a regular Switch. The difference in vibrancy of colors and how dark the blacks can get, it just adds this extra pop to the visuals that, you know, again, the first time you see it, you're like, oh yeah, this does look more colorful and nice. That's cool. And once you get used to it and go back to a regular Switch, you go, oh yeah, wow, this looks so much nicer on the OLED. I think one of the things that happened this past year that really made me appreciate it even more too, wasn't necessarily the time I spent with the Switch OLED itself versus regular Switches, but the release of the Steam Deck. I've said my piece before about how I don't think the Steam Deck and the Switch OLED are actual true competitors in a traditional sense. Yes, they're both handheld devices, but ultimately they go for very different markets. But when we are talking about ways these systems can be compared, one of the areas that really stood out to me for the Switch, specifically for the OLED, is the difference that the OLED display makes. The Steam Deck is absolutely capable of playing some better looking, higher graphically demanding games, which is an important difference, not to mention hitting higher frame rates than some titles that are available on the Switch. But when you look at games that run comparably on both systems, especially when you're looking at a lot of the indie scene, the Switch OLED ends up making for a better looking and feeling experience because of that OLED display the Steam Deck currently lacks. I think sometimes people really underestimate the importance of a display being used in their setup. You know, there tends to be a focus on, well, what's the system running things, what kind of frame rates are we hitting, what resolution, all of which is of course still very important, but ultimately the display is the thing bringing this to your eyes. And when you're talking about looking at regular versus OLED displays for televisions and monitors, that price difference gets to be a little more beefy. But when you're looking at something like the Switch, where it's $50 more to get this different display, there's actually a lot of value gained there in my mind. One thing I think is really important to touch on real quick too for the OLED display is that when the Switch OLED was coming out, one of the big questions a lot of people had was, you know, how afraid do we need to be of burn-in? Which in my mind at the time, I didn't really think it'd be a big issue at all. I think OLED displays have come to the point where, sure, burn-in is a thing that can occur, but as long as you're just regularly playing a game and letting it go to sleep when it's being inactive, it's not really a thing that should happen. But at the end of the day, that was still a fear that was in people's minds. Well, another creator who I have to give major props on for running this test and doing it is Wolfden. Bob actually did a test where after he got a Switch OLED, he left it running on a still image and just had it going for several months. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what the actual total count ended up being, and he did an additional update on this even later that he did as a short. Definitely check these videos out if OLED burn-in is a thing that you've been scared of with these systems, because he basically showed how, yeah, burn-in is a thing that can occur, but it takes a very long time of continuous use on a singular image, to the point where regular use, yeah, that's not going to be a thing that happens. So where does all this lead me in terms of, you know, was it worth upgrading right away, and would I even recommend to someone to upgrade when they already have a functional Switch? And I find myself coming more and more to the realization of, I actually think it was upgrading, even when already owning a functional Switch. Again, if you're a purely docked user, then yeah, not at all a situation. But if you play handheld primarily like I do, the OLED is made for such a better experience overall that if you have the ability to drop that much to upgrade, I think it actually was completely worth it. Really, the only thing that maybe gives a little extra hesitation is if you also rely on a number of accessories like grips and that kind of stuff, where the total cost is going to end up getting a little higher if you upgrade to an OLED, because guess what? Because it's a little longer, not all the same accessories are going to fit, and you're going to end up having to rebuy some stuff, which is a little bit of a headache, admittedly. Now, with that in mind though, one thing I do want to say though is that while I think it was great to upgrade to the Switch OLED when I did, maybe there's a little more reason right now to have hesitation, and it has to do with the fact that Nintendo has been really loving this 2-year life cycle with hardware. The original Switch came out in 2017, in 2019 we got the Switch Lite along with the Redbox Switch, and in 2021 we got the Switch OLED. Now while that doesn't necessarily mean Nintendo is always going to be releasing hardware in 2-year cycles, it does raise the question of, is something else on its way next year? What that hardware is, who actually knows, right? I mean, we already saw this happen with the rumor mill that led into the Switch OLED, where everyone was hoping it would be a Switch Pro. Maybe there's a Switch Pro next year, maybe there's just a Switch 4K, maybe it's just a full-blown Switch 2, or Nintendo throws a curveball and has some entirely new hardware planned for maybe next year or even the year after in 24. The main point I want to make is, it was great to upgrade to the Switch OLED when I did, but I can't help but be curious if in the next 6 to 8 months we get a reveal for something else. Which, funny enough, kind of reverts me a little bit back to my original stance, which is, you know, if you're already in the market for a new Switch for whatever reason, whether because you want to upgrade, you have to upgrade, or you've never gotten one before, the Switch OLED is 100% the way you should go. I mean, I have a lot of love for the Switch Lite as being an even smaller, nice little handheld, and maybe if you're in the market for something for a kid, that's a better way to go. But if you're grabbing something for yourself and you just want the best way of playing these games, the OLED is it because the display makes that much of an important difference. Simply put, in my mind, the Switch OLED is currently the definitive version of the Switch, and if you're in the market for one, that is the one you should get. But it's very possible that the entire landscape of this conversation is going to be different a year from now. Whether because something new has released, or because we have a much better idea of what is on the very close horizon.